In the 17th century, common Judeo-Christian tradition held that God, exercising his free will, had decided some thousands of years ago to create the world. Spinoza thinks that virtually every aspect of this traditional account is demonstrably false. He gives reasons for his conclusions. First, the biblical account is anthropomorphic. That is, it attributes human characteristics to God. Second, this view suggests that God has purposes, makes decisions, and possesses something called free will. Third, tradition views the creation as having occurred at a specific time in the past. Finally, the biblical account suggests that God is distinct from his creation. Spinoza explicitly argues against the traditional view on each of these points. The Hebrew Bible, which Christians refer to as the Old Testament, often attributes human characteristics to God. God is said in Genesis chapter 3, verse 8, to have walked around in the Garden of Eden as if he were a being who could walk. Human emotions are attributed to God, as when he's said to be jealous or that he gets angry. God is said to have a voice and a face. Spinoza argues that this biblical image of God is deeply confused. God, being infinite, cannot intelligibly be portrayed as having the finite physical form of a human being.
Everyone who has to any extent contemplated the divine nature denies that God is corporeal. By body, we understand any quantity with length, breadth, and depth, limited by some certain figure. Nothing more absurd than this can be said of God, that is, of a being absolutely infinite.
For these same reasons, Spinoza rejects the traditional view that God is either male or female. But even theologians who realized that God does not have a body still persisted in attributing to God human mental characteristics such as intellect, will, desire, and emotions. Spinoza thinks such views lead only to confusion. The sort of intellect and will that an infinite and eternal being might have would be entirely different from those possessed by finite, dependent beings such as ourselves. Spinoza says,
"The intellect and will that would constitute God's essence would have to be vastly different from human intellect and will, and would have no point of agreement except the name. They could be no more alike than the celestial constellation of the dog and the dog that barks."
Spinoza wrote in Latin, and when translating his texts into English, it's impossible to avoid the traditional pronoun he when referring to God. But in fact, as we've seen, Spinoza does not view God as a person at all. When someone wrote to him objecting to the impersonal character of his concept of God, Spinoza responded that people tend to think of God as a person because they project onto the divine those characteristics that they see as a human's best qualities.
"I believe that a triangle, if only it had the power of speech, would say in like manner that God is eminently triangular. And a circle would say that the divine nature is eminently circular. And in this way, each thing would ascribe its own attributes to God, and make itself like unto God."
The biblical creation story suggests that at some point God decided to create the world. This decision has most often been interpreted as an act of God's free will. But Spinoza rejects the claim that God has free will, and his arguments are rooted deep in his basic philosophy. For one thing, it seems to Spinoza that attributing free will to God is one more case of anthropomorphically ascribing to God that which humans think are their own best characteristics. But more important, Spinoza says that in this instance, the traditionalists are wrong, not only about the nature of God, but also about themselves as human beings. According to Spinoza, there is no such thing as free will, divine or human. When we say that someone's acted of his own free will, we usually mean it was possible under the circumstances to make a different choice. Many philosophers have concluded that an act of free will cannot be fully determined by outside causes. Spinoza's view that all things in nature are part of a single, unified, causal system leads him to deny that there can be any such thing as free will. If human will were free in this sense, we would be able to determine our own natures. We would be causes of ourselves, so to speak, and thus each of us would be substances. But Spinoza holds firmly that there can be only one substance, one infinite entity which is cause of itself. Descartes had said that each human mind is a substance, and that each mind has an unlimited power of free will. But Spinoza disagrees on this. Our minds and bodies are not substances, he says. They are modes of the one infinite substance. They're parts of the whole of nature, where other things and the unchanging laws of nature determine the existence and actions of each mind and body. Thus, he denies free will exists.
In the mind, there is no absolute or free will, but the mind is determined to will this or that by a cause, which is also determined by another, and this again by another, and so on to infinity.
Spinoza knows that most people believe they have free will, and he tries to explain how they've come to such a mistaken notion.
Men think themselves free because they are conscious of their volitions and their desires, but they do not think, even in their dreams, of the causes which determine them to want and desire, for they are ignorant of these causes.
In a famous letter, Spinoza uses the example of a stone to illustrate his meaning.
Let us think of a very simple thing. For example, a stone receives from an external cause which impels it a certain quantity of motion, with which it will afterwards necessarily continue to move even when the impact of the external cause has ceased. What is here said of the stone must be understood of each individual thing, that is, that each thing is necessarily determined by an external cause to exist and to act in a definite and determinate manner.
Then, for purposes of illustration, Spinoza fancifully asks us to imagine what the stone would think if it had a mind like ours.
Next, conceive, if you please, that the stone, while it continues in motion, thinks, and knows that it is striving to continue in motion. Surely this stone, inasmuch as it is conscious only of its own effort, will believe that it is completely free, and that it continues in motion for no other reason than because it wants to. And such is the human freedom, which all men boast that they possess, and which consists solely in this, that men are conscious of their desires, and are ignorant of the causes by which they are determined.